Welcome everybody to our IIoT World Energy Day session on net zero in an industrial world. Now, before we jump into the topic, I'm going to do a quick bit of housekeeping. We'll introduce Karsten and Tony, who are joining us here today. But also, when we talk about net zero in an industrial world, we're going to focus here on net zero out at the edge and primarily around data centers at the edge. Now, before we begin, just a quick bit of housekeeping. This session is live, and if you have any questions, please do put your questions in the Q&A. That's what we'll be watching for and curating the different questions that are coming in. You can also use the chat function just to say hello, tell us where you are calling in from the different around the world. We've several thousand people registered from 80 different countries, and seeing the first session there a few minutes ago, it was very interactive. So we want it as interactive as possible. And for anyone who asks a question, there will be some draw and raffle later for some books from the keynote speaker this morning, and also a yearly membership for IIoT World community. So with that, we will, this day would not be possible without all of the sponsors. So a shout out to Hitachi Vantara, HiveMQ, Fortinet, Siemens, Trend Micro, and Ursula Leo, and specifically for this session to Schneider Electric. So thank you very much. Without that, these days would not happen. Many of you will be familiar with IIoT World. IIoT World is a leading authority in industrial IoT. It's a digital media outlet bringing the latest and greatest trends in the industrial Internet of Things to almost 280,000 people within their community. And this type of day and many others, you'll find it all on their website. So there's new content coming out day after day. So with that, let's start to dive in. So I'm delighted to be joined here today by Karsten Baumann, the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Schneider Electric, and he's also a solution architect, and by Tony Grayson, the General Manager at Compass Data Center. As I mentioned, the topic for our discussion here is about net zero in an industrial world. And last week, I happened to be up at Hannover Messe, and the whole concept of net zero sustainability in the entire industrial Internet of Things was a key theme. Now, before we jump in, I quickly want to ask both Karsten and Tony to give a quick introduction. So Karsten, over to you, sir.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So my name is Karsten Baumann. As Kevin mentioned, I'm with Schneider Electric. I've been with Schneider Electric for 10 years now. I'm based in Colorado here in the United States. And I'm a solution architect where we help our clients to solve some of their business challenges or problems through the means of innovation and new technology and concepts. And the idea of net zero is very important, not only in the industrial world, but everywhere as everything gets digitized and more and more data is becoming available. And so I'm fortunate enough that over the last 4+ years, I have been able to study microgrids as it specifically relates to data centers or on-site renewable energy generation, and to become more sustainable and ultimately with the goal to become net zero.
Thank you, Karsten. And Tony, good morning. I believe you're on the West Coast.
I am. So it's 6 a.m. my time. But good morning. Hello. Tony Grayson. I am a general manager for Compass Quantum. And I had a very different path to tech. I did 21 years in the U.S. Navy. My life goal was to command my own submarine. I did that. And then, but I spent most of my time out at sea. So I want to spend more time with my family. So since then, it's been, a couple of years at Meta, and then some time at AWS. And most recently, it was, about 3.5 years at Oracle, running their cloud infrastructure. But I wanted to, kind of make my own product, kind of run a business. And so that's why I came over to Compass to run kind of their edge product. Okay. And I'm working with Karsten and trying to figure that out too.
Partners in crime.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think as we look at net zero in today's world and in the industrial world, it is all about partnerships, right? Nobody can do it all themselves, and there's many moving pieces. Now, Tony, you just mentioned you probably traveled the world, and looking at the chat, I see we have folks from Nigeria, Malaysia, Japan, Detroit, India, England, whatever, I can't keep up. There's too many chats, but many people around the world. Now, while different, if we talk about net zero in an industrial world, obviously it means different things to different people, and it may have slightly different implications as we go around the world. But at the same time, just for to level set here, Karsten, can you explain to us, to kind of kick off the conversation, in terms of what are we talking about here this morning when we talk about at the edge being net zero, and specifically around data centers?
Yeah, so I think the definition of what is the edge, from a data's perspective, and how the data is being processed and stored, and network connectivity is provided, that's probably in the eye of the beholders, and there's really no right or wrong definition about it. So when we look, for example, at the data center market itself and the different segmentations, let's say at the top of the pyramid, we talk about the hyperscalers, and we're talking about the Microsofts, the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebooks, and they are building, gigantic data centers, 50, 100, 200 megawatts, and just to put this in perspective, the average residential consumer in the United States consumes about the power draw is about 1.2 kilowatt. So that means somewhere between 50, 100 to 200,000 residential off-takers. That equates to the same amount of energy, for one of those large hyperscale data centers. But then we also have the service providers. The two largest in the world, is Equinix and Digital Realty, and then Compass, where Tony represents this company, is another one, where they build the large infrastructure to put, their compute power for enterprise data centers into it. And then itself, there's the enterprise data center, like, the banks, the financial institutions, the transportation, like airlines, for example. There's different reasons why some corporations may want to have their own data center. Now, when we look now at the edge, which is an ever-growing market, the hyperscalers, they looking, how can we go to secondary and tertiary markets, to come closer to our customer? So they're building still very large data centers, but they would define that for themselves as that being the edge. When I look at, like Compass, for example, and Tony will speak more about it, we're seeing like, data and capacity being deployed, again, closer to the consumer, closer to where the data is being generated or where the data is being consumed for various applications. And I think Kevin will speak later a little bit about the different use cases. And then, of course, the enterprise, when you think about healthcare, for example, large hospitals, they may have a large centralized data center, perhaps hosted in one of those service providers' facilities, and yet they have their own small data center within each facility in order to have the electronic patient records available, for those patients who are in the hospital, who have been in the hospital not until recently. And then when you go down to, more like industrial applications for whether this is industrial manufacturing, distribution warehouses, or hotels, for example, if you check into a hotel, at a Hilton, at a Marriott, or wherever that might be, they have a small IT closet sitting somewhere where your reservation data is hosted, and where information about what you consume and your loyalty program is being stored. So the edge varies depending on what kind of data center customer you're talking about. However, they all have one thing in common. It's about getting closer to the customer, closer to where the data is being generated or where the data is being consumed.
Okay, thanks, Karsten. And Tony, we had the opportunity to chat last week and kind of a lead up to this. So to kind of focus in on that edge and bringing the data closer to the customer, where do you see this playing out, or how playing it out?
I think there's a lot of conversation about what the edge actually means, and I don't really think as a physical infrastructure provider, it really matters, because I think the edge is defined by the platform that makes it. And so it could be, if I'm a gaming platform, I have a different version of what edge is. If I'm, any kind of, a CDN, I have a different definition of what edge is. And so to me, the problem is not really where the edge is and how it is, but it's how do you service that edge? And that's kind of where, I think the focus needs to be, instead of trying to define what it is.
Okay. Now, I suppose, Karsten, you also mentioned when we were chatting recently was that, to Tony's point, it's not about how you define the edge. It depends on the platform and
Yep.
the use case, and we come to some of that in the later. But you're seeing some massive expansion in the need for these edge data centers. Could you share some of the figures that you had there?
No, I mean, for me, what I'm seeing is this expansion, and there's definitely always going to be cloud. But what you're seeing right now is an expansion of people developing products that are on the edge, and they go to the platform, which, who's the consumer, which is really us. And so, with my phone, what platform do I need to service that, where I'm at right now, which is, at a hotel in Santa Clara, California, right outside Levi Stadium. But, it's what's the platform that needs to be developed to help me, do what I need to do at that edge. And so I think what you're seeing right now is, really kind of companies looking to take advantage of, whatever latency that they need to develop that app that can deliver a product to me. And so it could be a latency sensitive product, which means it needs to be right next door to me, or it could be more of a, of a storage product that can go in a kind of a colo data center. And so I think, everything is different, and it depends where you need to be at right now on the edge, like everything else, of course.
Alrighty. Now, and Carsten, if I may, just there's two questions coming in, and folks, please keep the questions coming in because we'll take them as we go. And if I may, Carsten, just one question that popped up there was that, what do we mean by bringing the data closer to the customer? And I suppose I'll put some context on it. The IT world I grew up in with Compaq, HP, and Intel was that, it was the big mainframe when I started out, and then it was client server, and then it went back to the big cloud, and all the data was going to the cloud.
And I would say the mainframe's still there too for some of these FinServ companies.
True.
Exactly.
The mainframes haven't gone away, but
Nope,
Carsten,
exactly.
how do you see bringing the data closer to the customer? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, a very good example is like if I pick up my cell phone or my tablet, so that is that's the closest point where I can bring data to the consumer, right? So whether I'm watching a movie, whether I'm checking the weather, trying to find out how to go from A to B and using some applications, for navigation purposes, but then that's just me as an individual user. But then when we think about as I mentioned, for example, like a hotel, right? So where the data about a guest checking in into the hotel is being processed, directly at the hotel itself, and then the collective information, the summary of it, your portfolio of your stay and the duration and so forth, that then gets uploaded, to Tony's point, to the cloud somewhere. So there's where the data is closer to the customer. Or in an industrial setting, when you think about smart manufacturing, where a lot of new sensors, creating an enormous amount of data, and that data does not necessarily all needs to be uploaded to the cloud for any kind of analytics, but it's being processed directly in, let's say, the manufacturing facility itself. So bringing the data closer to where the consumption is of the data, or where the data is being generated.
Okay. And Tony?
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that. So there's a concept called data gravity. And really the data gravity concept is, once you generate all this data, you bring the compute to where the data needs to be generated. Because if you're not doing that and you're pushing the data to a cloud, it's too expensive. And so this whole thing about you just follow the data. So if, let's say I'm a movie studio, and I'm filming Top Gun, let's just say, I have 5 cameras going, 3,000 gigabits per second. Why would I do anything with that data other than collect that data on-prem and render that data, do whatever, manipulate that data on-prem instead of trying to push it somewhere else? Because we're talking, thousands and thousands and thousands of gigabits. It doesn't make any sense to do anything else other than keep that data where it's at and use that data where it's at, because that's the cheapest way to do it.
Yeah, and then Kevin, you mentioned earlier about the size of the data itself, right? So there's still true today, a comparison where we say like 90% of all the digital data that is available today has been generated in the last 2 years. So think about it. So it's like, And now, and it's been true for the last decade or so. So therefore, if we make this assumption that, you know, in the next 2 years, we will create 90% of all the data that's available today in the next 2 years. So that's a massive amount of data. And it's also been predicted that the data center capacity collectively, globally, hyperscalers, edge, enterprises, everything will about to double by 2040. So this is an enormous amount of, infrastructure that needs to be built. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when these large data centers consume, you know, like 50, 100, 200 megawatts, that's an enormous amount of energy. So currently, the energy globally for all data centers, depending on what kind of research you're looking at, is somewhere between 1% and 2% of all the global energy consumption is going to data centers. We also have, now, this may not sound a lot, but it's an enormous amount of energy. And we also see that somewhere in the next decade, all the edge applications, and that's very loosely defined, what is really edge? It might be one IT server sitting somewhere in a closet on a manufacturing corner somewhere. It might be, you know, a 1 megawatt data center for some other applications. But those edge applications collectively, in the next decade, they will consume more energy than all the big data centers, the hyperscalers together. So when you think about the explosion of data, the infrastructure required in order to process, analyze it, and store it, and then, you know, the amount of energy needed. So net zero, or the ability to be more sustainable, to not do it exactly the same way we've done it over the last 1 or 2 decades, is really, really important for us in order to make it more sustainable.
And I suppose that is the key thing at the heart of the conversation we're having there, is that, look, there's going to be data explosion. We're going to find more and more reasons for generating data, using that data, using it locally, consuming it closer to the customer, and. But I suppose the whole focus here is, how do we do that sustainably? And if I may, again, in the world I grew up in, it'd be like, oh, well, I need to build a data center, and they were all built uniquely, and it took X amount of time, and there was a lot of, you know, and today we talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 in terms of that infrastructure. And I suppose if we look at building out the infrastructure we need over the next couple of years, for the next 10 years, because it's not going to be thrown away in a year's time, it's going to be there for a while. Now is the time do we need to think about things differently? And if I may, Tony, from your perspective, how do you think differently about building out this infrastructure sustainably?
Yeah, so I think it really comes down, I mean, it's a money proposition, and it's an R&D proposition. And so if I'm building a 100 megawatt data center, how much am I willing to risk on some new technology that a platform like, you know, Google, Facebook, or whoever may not accept? And so that's why I think the edge is super interesting, because it is such a low cost option for the edge. And so, you know, let's just say I'm working with, you know, Karsten from Schneider Electric, and this might be something we're doing right now. And it's, you know, a microgrid solution, you know, kind of where a microgrid provides you that PV and battery backup for your solution, is actually not cost prohibitive. And it's a super simple way to do, you know, let's say 100 kilowatts in, you know, the middle of a place where you can't drag in the power, you know, 3-phase, 208 volts power. And so I think, you know, at the edge, it's just super interesting because it's not cost prohibitive. You actually might have to do it to provide, you know, kind of edge computing or edge storage kind of solutions to wherever you're going. And it actually makes your, you know, kind of your deployment simpler if you look at those kind of way to do sustainable products. And it's, you know, it's a lot easier to do. And so I think, you know, everything that we're talking about with the hyperscale, so 100 megawatt plus data centers, will start with an edge R&D kind of product on how they do it, and then they figure out how to deploy it, how to scale it at the, you know, the best price.
Alrighty. And Karsten, if I may, I know when we were chatting last week, you mentioned as well, in that you also have to look at, how would you say, it's not just running the thing. And I see a question in here in terms of how do you measure the data and energy management. And Tony, you mentioned a microgrid for the energy costs. But when you folks are looking at people saying, okay, I'm going to build an edge data center, how do you talk to them about how do you design something sustainability? Do you make it more modular? Do you make it more, different materials that you use? How does that come about?
Yeah, I think when we talk about sustainability, we not only have to look at the energy consumption itself, right? And where is this energy being generated? So does it come from a diesel generator? Does it come from a coal plant or from a nuclear plant or wind farms or solar farms? And your hydrogen, so there's different technologies available today. So that's one component. And obviously, because of the large amount of energy we collectively in the data center industry are consuming, we want to make sure that the energy we procure, is as sustainable as possible. So there's a lot of initiatives happening right now in different countries around the world. Germany, for example, over 50% of all the energy required in Germany comes from renewable resources. So that's a good way of actually, implementing more sustainable energy solutions for the consumption of the energy. Now, that's only one part. When we look at the materials, for example, that are being required to build an infrastructure, any infrastructure, we have to sustainably source those. And then when we look at sustainability, we have to look at the overall life cycle assessment, and when we think about circular economy, so for example, again, I'm going back to the simple question about, when I'm purchasing an iPhone or any mobile device, doesn't have to be an iPhone, right? Am I, as a consumer, how am I concerned about how sustainable is this device am I buying? How much recycled materials are in here? Where are the resources or the raw materials needed? Where do they come from? How where they're sourced? And then also, how long am I using this phone? Am I using this and throwing it away and upgrading it a year or 2 years from now? Or am I keeping it maybe for 3 or 4 years, which then also has I'm prolonging the life of a piece of equipment. So therefore the usage becomes more sustainable. And then ultimately at the end, when it ends of life is being reached, how much of this material in a device can be actually recycled and be used for something else? And for example, a lot of stuff, and Tony mentioned about battery energy storage system. We think about all the electrical vehicles which are already on the road, and which will be on the road. So there's a massive amount of, most of the times, it's lithium-ion batteries. When they are no longer good for a car, they will have a second life. So they can be used for something else in different applications. For example, in a data center. So it's certainly possible, no longer good for a car, but still can be used for other applications. So sustainability is not just about energy consumption, but holistically, we have to look at the entire life cycle assessment.
Alrighty. Folks, I see questions flying in here, and we're going to start pulling them in at the time. I'm also seeing a couple of questions popping up in the chat window. Please do post your questions in the Q&A, because that's where we can curate them. We can't keep track of all the different things in the chat window. But Tony, to Karsten's point there, from what you're doing at Compass, can you explain how you're looking at, if you like, designing the infrastructure that houses these edge data centers?
I think you have to look at it. I mean, edge is simpler to me because it's obviously smaller, and I'm building a much smaller kind of infrastructure to house that platform and whatever that platform is going to be. And so I think you need to look at it a little bit differently. You can't just go down the path of what's been done before. So, typically if you look at edge kind of modules, they're typically made out of, they're all made out of steel or they're made out of concrete. And so, that's an easy way to do a solution, but I think there's other ways to do it. And, what we're looking at right now, it's called, my little business line is called Quantum, but we are actually looking at how to use composites that are more sustainable, that are easy to manufacture, that kind of give you that kind of capability and gives you that kind of reliability or durability of steel in a composite way. And I think, technologies moved pretty far in the most recent years, and whether it's a, carbon fiber, it's a fiber reinforced plastic or whatever, I think there are much better options than traditional uses of steel or concrete we've seen with kind of the containers before.
So a lot of this is, I think it was Lisa, I don't get the second name here. It was about we need to think about, it's not about doing business as usual. And Tony,
Oh,
to
yeah.
your point, it's you need to think about these things differently.
No,
in
I think you have to think about
materials.
it. You have to think about it differently. I mean, there's a way, steel is awesome, but it's a high carbon footprint when you make a module out of that. But you can actually use like a different composite that makes it cheap. It's cheaper, it's more sustainable, and it's a quicker time to manufacture by doing that kind of stuff. You just have to, I hate to say it, but use the term think outside the box on how you can do this kind of stuff. You don't have to, you shouldn't be using the same material that everyone else is using. I think you have to challenge yourself to figure out, and what Carsten really talked about with this, how do you make an iPhone, and what goes into it is your scope 3. So you have to go deep in your supply chain and figure out what's the embedded carbon that's there, what's the energy that it takes to make it, and how do you minimize that as much as humanly possible. And I think it's super simple. It's not super simple, but I think it's a lot easier to do with a module kind of edge data center than it is for a 100 megawatt campus.
Yeah, when you think about, Kevin, like when you deploy 100 kilowatt edge data center somewhere, let's say in an urban environment, you may have the land available to put photovoltaic in there and to use it and so forth. If you build a 100 megawatt data center, that's a very energy dense application. You would need a massive amount of land. You need about 4 to 5 acres of land to put photovoltaic on it to generate 1 megawatt. So now think about it. It would be 100 megawatts. So that's like 400 to 500 acres of land, and that would only be generating, of course, the electricity when the sun is shining, right? So not at night and so forth. So you can imagine the scale of it. So deploying something in a sustainable way on the edge is much simpler than on the large hyperscale side.
Yep.
Now, if I may, Tony, you mentioned earlier, and Carsten as well, in terms of the industries that all industries are looking at moving more data closer to the edge, processing it locally. It varies depending on the industry and the use case. But have you any examples of industries that are kind of doing this well today, or examples you've come across? Who's kind of doing the right thing these days?
I'm sorry, you mean like doing it well in terms of doing it in a sustainable way?
Yes, sorry, thinking differently, heading down the path that you're evangelizing here.
Well, first of all, I think, we've seen certainly tremendously fueled with the pandemic, right? So the digital explosion of data, whether it's remote learning, schooling, all these elements. But that's just one element. But all the industries, we're like talking about digitization. We are even digitizing energy, right? To be able to see where it's coming from, how it's being created, how is it being used, how effectively, and so forth. So almost every process around the world, is people thinking about digitizing it in order to leverage new information, new analytics, in order to make it more productive, more efficient, achieving higher quality. And we see, so these industries, and when I think about smart warehouses, smart cities, smart infrastructures, there are ways of utilizing this new digital information to derive better business value. And in terms of making it more sustainable, I guess it really depends. I don't think there is one particular industry that does it better than others. It's about the mindset from the top leadership in the organization itself, who are making commitments to sustainability. We see it in the data center industry where, not only is it good practice to be, of course, most energy efficient, because the greenest, energy consumption is, or the greenest electron, so to speak, is the one you don't even really need. So therefore, if we can reduce energy, and a good example might be buildings in general, office buildings and everything. So we think about 80% of all the buildings are inefficient. So if we can now digitize the process, where are people am I in the office or not? Can I turn off the lights? Can I change the temperature settings and so forth? So now I'm actually using digital information to be able to measure what I'm doing and how to use it, and then therefore reduce the overall energy consumption, and therefore I become more sustainable. So I think we see it in different industries, including manufacturing, transportation, and you just name it. So there's multiple examples, but it's not per se one industry does it particularly well over another. It's about the mindset of the people driving sustainability forward.
Yeah, and I'll add on that, I'm down here in really Santa Clara this week, and it's really was to talk with, the iMasons have actually signed, so iMasons, infrastructure masons, it's really to get a bunch of like-minded physical infrastructure providers together, but they've drafted an iMasons climate accord, and the climate accord, it really is to go after your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and deliver, savings by, a certain date, which is, TBD on the date because we're still talking about it. But, it's 150 companies that have gotten together, and it's companies that are, from my as a colo provider to Karsten as a supplier on, kind of the electrical mechanical side to, companies that are like Cisco, which is, kind of providing routers and that kind of stuff. And it's how do we leverage our technology together? How do we leverage our the smart people we have on the payroll to come together with a solution that benefits, kind of the world. This is not about, sustainability to me is not about, it's not a cost thing. It's not an enabler to have me outsell X, Y, or Z. It's more about, what do we have to do to provide a more sustainable solution for the world so we can be a better, kind of a better product and more philanthropic on how do we help out the world kind of thing, and it's a very different concept than I think that most people kind of think about it.
Kevin, I just wrote something in the Q&A session here, which I thought it was really funny. That's why I started smiling here. So Nestor was saying, like, smart houses, smart buildings, smart cars, yes, but how about smart people in all capital? So I think it starts with us individually, right? So what's my behavior and what are my drivers, and what I try to accomplish, whether it's in my personal life, in my professional life, in my career, and so forth. So I think smart people, that's a big challenge, right? But it's a good opportunity because it starts with us individually, and then all us individually together, it's collectively, we can make things happen.
No, I agreed. For folks that know me, I spend my time looking at new technologies and primarily their impact in the energy industry. But one of my taglines for the last probably 10 years is that, technology is the easy bit. It's when us humans get involved that it gets more complicated. And sometimes we're not as smart as we think we are, right? So very, very good point. Let me come back here. I have a bunch of more topics here, but also I'm just looking at some of the questions. And Tony, if I may, now for folks, if you click on Tony's bio in the session or on the website, you'll get to his company and you'll see the type of modular data centers that they're putting together. There's a question here in terms of, excuse my pronunciation, Meda. And it's, Tony, you mentioned that, if you build it today out of steel and concrete, whatever, there's a certain embedded carbon of all the different emissions that were to create that. You're taking a different approach. But for the average person out there, where do they get access to this kind of information to go, well, what's good, what's bad? How do I balance these things?
That's we're trying to figure that kind of stuff out right now, because it needs to be a blend of a supplier like Karsten to a builder like Compass and what we're doing. And I think we need to provide that kind of capability, and whether it's a QR code that you can go to a module or a data center and use that QR code and get all your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions into that kind of stuff. But we need to make it easily accessible to the customer, because, kind of trying to hide behind spreadsheets and Excel and databases, it's not helpful at all. And I think we have to make it, totally consumable. So when you make a decision of where you want to put your money or where you want to put your data, you should have that carbon, footprint, up front and center, so you can, vote with your money and go with that more, sustainable solution than a higher sustainable solution. And so I think we're talking about this week and what kind of label that teams, and whether it's like a if you go to the back of, most food products have a calorie intake. Why don't we have a carbon intake? And you can kind of know that this is my scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, the embedded carbon in whatever product that you're doing right now. And that's what we're trying to figure out now, the best way to do that. And not only the best way to do it in terms of gathering data, but also the best way to present it for the consumer.
All righty. Carsten, I know at Schneider Electric, you have a huge drive around sustainability. You guys are looking at the whole scope 1, 2, and 3. How are you looking at this with customers going, how do I map apples to oranges here? How help me?
Yeah, I think first of all, just for definition, right? So scope 1 are the greenhouse gas emissions that are created by your own operation. So let's say if I drive a car, if I run a generator, so whatever I do in my own operation, that's scope 1. Scope 2 is the the energy I'm acquiring, whether it's electricity, whether it's natural gas or heat or other elements. So greenhouse gas emissions related to sourced energy. And scope 3, Tony mentioned it already, is the embedded carbon. So if I'm building something, a widget, a car, an air handler, a UPS, a switchgear, or a modular data center, there's all these different components inside, and each of those components, they have their own embedded carbon footprint. So when we look at, for example, using a diesel generator or a natural gas generator, we can compare those in terms of their scope 1 emissions. So when they run, how much greenhouse gas emissions do they produce? So a natural gas generator is approximately has about 12% less greenhouse gas emissions, compared to a diesel generator. But then when you look at the embedded carbon, fundamentally, a diesel and natural gas generator, they're comprised out of the same materials. However, since the energy density for diesel is higher, you need to build a natural gas generator about 20% larger to generate the same amount of energy. So therefore, my operational greenhouse gas emissions, they're about 12% lower when I run it. At the same time, when I source the generator, I have about a 20% higher embedded carbon footprint for a natural gas generator versus a diesel generator. And I think in the industry, we need to look at the entire greenhouse gas emissions profile, not only using the example from an electrical vehicle. They have no tailpipe emissions, not only because they don't have a tailpipe, but they don't have any combustion fuels in there. So they're just discharging a battery. So when I drive a car from A to B, I do not have any scope 1 emissions. I do have scope 2 emissions because when I put it in the garage and I charge it, we have to ask ourselves, where's the energy coming from to recharge the battery? Does it come from a sustainable wind farm or does it come from a coal power plant? So therefore, there are scope 2 emissions related to me driving from A to B. And then, of course, I need to manufacture the car. And there's a huge amount of lithium-ion batteries and embedded carbon inside that kind of car. So there was a great TED talk about a year or 2 years ago talking about and doing a comparison about how many miles throughout the life of a car do you have to drive that electrical vehicle actually becomes, from an overall greenhouse gas emissions profile, more sustainable than an internal combustion engine car. And so I can't remember any of the detail, but I think it was about if you drive 5,000 miles a year, or 8,000 kilometers a year, right, with an electrical vehicle, and you do this for 15 years, your internal combustion engine collectively might be more sustainable than the electrical vehicle. However, if you drive more, then all of a sudden you come at this cross point, because now the embedded carbon offsets the non-emission, non-scope 1 greenhouse gases not coming out of the tailpipe, offset the higher embedded carbon footprint of electrical vehicle. So we have to look at these collectively, not just scope 1, 2, and 3, but what's the overall usage itself.
All righty. Now, if I may, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Again, the world I grew up in, Compaq, HP, Intel. About 10, 15 years ago, I was running around telling everyone, oh, cloud, next best thing. You don't need your own data center, move to the cloud, it's cheaper. you don't have to hire all the cybersecurity people. They'll do it for you, blah. Now we're kind of moving back down to the industrial data center at the edge. And do people turn around and go, but hang on a second, is that going to be more expensive for me? Do I need to hire my own staff locally? I save on the communications thing, the latency, blah, blah, blah. But Tony, how do you deal with that with people and say, there was a question in here, I believe from Harry, in terms of, for small scale industries or startups, can they adopt this, or does it make cost effective sense for them?
No, I think it depends on your application and what you're trying to actually do. I mean, there's definitely ways for the cloud. The cloud is always there. You could do bare metal or virtualized services, and you're going to pay a price for that. But there's some people who, latency matters. There are some people who want security, physical security matters. They want something inside their fence line, or even a CIO wants to go hug their servers, or, I'm sure Carsten kisses a computer every day. And so it's, there is definitely a use case for that, what that on-prem is. And I think if you go to a cloud provider and you honestly ask them, what do you expect it to be? It's probably going to be somewhere around 60-40 or 50-50. I mean, they don't expect everything to be in the cloud. They expect, to get those kind of, small, mid, kind of large, or maybe even larger enterprises that are using, kind of their apps to develop their own kind of products. But they also recognize that there will be a lot of stuff that's going to happen kind of on-prem. And, the interesting thing with the edge is you have on-prem and you have the cloud and you have everything in between. And so, I honestly think, and, Uptime will agree with me on this one, is the future really is data centers everywhere, because, your Tesla, version 100 or whatever is going to require, a road which has a bunch of sensors on it, which is going to go back to a kind of a station with that aggregates that data that pushes it out to the other Teslas. And it's not only that, but it's an IoT or a gaming platform is going to require something different. A stadium on a soccer pitch or a football pitch, sorry, which is going to collect data or tell you where to go to use the restroom, or get food quickly, is going to use a different product. There's all these products that are going to define where the data center needs to be. But essentially, if you think about, we're going to have data centers everywhere. You might even have a data center in your home now to run your refrigerator, your ovens, and that kind of stuff. I mean, so that's kind of where I think we're headed, and that the cloud can't do that kind of stuff. And on-prem is a different solution. So you have the on-prem for enterprise customer, you have the cloud that can service them, but you're going to have this whole middle in-betweens, kind of scenario where you're going to have a bunch of data centers, and that's what people, I think, are trying to figure out.
Okay, and if I may, if we look at you're with AWS, with various companies, and if you look at the way they've architected the technology, so be it Docker, Kubernetes, virtualization, you name it, that same technology can be deployed down in the edge data center, right?
It's exactly right.
It's the same technology.
If you look at Oracle, I mean, Oracle has a thing called dedicated region, and they recognize that companies will not want to, because of data privacy, whatever reasons, they will not want to deploy their metadata or data to the edge. And so what they've decided to do was, hey, I'm Oracle, I'm going to, basically get my OS down to a minimum amount of racks, which is, probably about 50 racks, and I'm going to bring a region to you. And so it's a dedicated region. So you get the benefits of cloud, the management of cloud, all in your own side fence line, and Oracle deploys a region right to you. And so, but I do think, there's some version of that, and you have Outpost, and you have Wavelength. There's all these different versions to be able to provide that kind of capability to a customer, where we bring it closer to you from a latency, from a security, from, a privacy on your metadata, that kind of stuff. And so I do think, these regulations that we're seeing up, will drive a lot of these kind of solutions right now, because you can't just send all your data to Ashburn. I know everyone thinks you can do that, but from a privacy perspective, you might have to keep some of that data inside your fence line, or in a close to inside your own country or region, because that's the regulators are going to make you do.
No, I agreed.
It's Gaia X. I mean, that really is, Gaia X is the European kind of move to do this kind of stuff. And so, keeping your data in Germany is different than keeping your data in France, which is different than keeping your data in Spain. And, you can't cross these borders kind of thing. And so, It's how do we regulate that data so and meet what the regulators are. And all the regulators are doing is they have a clipboard, they have a checklist, and they don't really care how you built your data center. They're just like, do you have power? Yes. Do I have on-site generation? Yes. Do you keep your data inside the fence, the fence line of whatever European country you're in? Yes. And that's all they really care about. It's a very, very simplistic checklist.
I was going to mention, in the world I live in energy industry, depending on the country you're in, depending on the company, there are company rules, there are regulatory rules, and let's say here in the European Union, as you mentioned, GAIA-X, with the healthcare, sometimes health records can't move physical border.
You can't do that. I mean, that's kind of where at Oracle we took a very different position. We didn't build a simple 380. We didn't build a 380 option. Our whole thing was, I'm going to put a data center in every single country that is based on GAIA-X. I'm going to have a DR inside that country to back up your data as well. But that's how we're going to, kind of put the cloud out there, and was really to provide that capability so you can keep your data inside that fence line, the regulatory fence line. And I think that's hugely important when you're trying to look at how to build these data centers and where you go. You have to be able to think, what are the regulators going to want on FinServs and metadata and personal privacy, all that kind of information.
Alrighty. Karsten, there's a question in here from Gib Wood in terms of, as what they've seen is that many industries, they want to have an ROI of whatever, 2 years or less, in terms of if I do anything with sustainability on it, I have to get the ROI in 2 years, and then sometimes the numbers are hard to add up. And I think that depends on the company and the policies and whatever. But what are you seeing out there today? Are people looking for more sustainability? Is it have the equations changed in terms of ROI?
I think there are new equations or new metrics applied to what a reasonable equation is for sustainability. So for example, generally in data centers, yes, if somebody comes up, hey, we have this new wonderful technology and it saves energy and it's all, it's more sustainable or whatever it is, companies evaluating it. If there's no payback within 2 years, then probably won't do it. When you look at, for example, microgrids, for renewable on-site power generation, and whether these are combinations of fuel cells or battery energy storage combined maybe with longer term storage or generation capacity such as natural gas. And when we're looking at the software required to intelligently kind of control all of this to make it more financially viable and to make it more sustainable, typically the 2-year ROI for the investment that needs to be made, it doesn't really pencil out, right? However, so we have companies now, including Schneider Electric, we have formed joint ventures with the Carlyle Group and Huck Capital. One company is called Alpha Structure, the other one's called Green Structure, where now you can have energy as a service. So you can deploy, let's say, renewable on-site power generation where you, the consumer, the customer, doesn't have to put CapEx down and put it on their books, but instead of they're using it as an operational model, because the payback can easily be 15 years out. So which then under normal circumstances, if somebody just looks at, hey, there's no payback in 2 years, I'm not doing it. So that would be prohibitive for becoming more sustainable. So we're looking at new innovative kind of financial models in order to kind of facilitate the adoption of more sustainable practices, and yet use it as an operational expenditure model versus a CapEx model, traditionally how it's been used. Yeah. So there's different ways of doing this from a financial construct, and I think that's very helpful to excel our industry and other industries forward to adopt more sustainability.
And I would say, to add on what you're saying, Karsten, I mean, the CFOs in the group might hate me for saying this, but how much money do you really need as a business? And I think that's something we all got to ask ourselves, because some of these more sustainable solutions are definitely a lot more expensive than non-sustainable solutions, but maybe that's just okay. And maybe you're, instead of your margin is 20%, maybe your margin goes to 15%. I mean, you're still making money, but what do you want to do? What do you want to leave, kind of the world and that aspect of it. And I think it's a different way of thinking, which it's not about the bottom line. It's more about, kind of how can I build a solution that has the minimal impact and I could still build a business off of it. And I think we have to have this mind shift change of, it's not about, how much money I can make. It's more about, how much money, or how can I not impact the earth with kind of these solutions? And then it's separately is, does that still make me a profit? And I think we all need to kind of come with this more philanthropic kind of attitude and how we build and run our business than, how much more can I line my pockets? Because, in some of these companies, when you're making it, especially in data center world, when you're making, 32, 34, look at Switch, that was like a 32x kind of buy by Digital Bridge. I mean, what are we actually doing for the environment while we're doing that? And I think it's just a mind shift change. Like I said, the people who provide the capital need to understand that, and the CFOs need to understand that kind of stuff. And I think they're there, and I think they're, going that direction, but it's just not about the bottom line.
Oh, and Lisa just made a comment, the term has been around for a couple of years, the triple bottom line thinking, and the whole ESG factoring in, and the reputation, and right? The equations are changing.
Yeah, they are changing, but you have to really you have to put the environment in. I mean, it's a very simple thing to do, but I mean, you have to put the environment first, and then what the solutions that interest you and how you incorporate that, and what's your bottom line after that. And if you're still making a buck, then to me, your company is successful about it. But you can't just go in there going, well, I want, have this 50% margin or whatever, and then I'm going to do sustainability and shoehorn around it. It's just greenwashing. I mean, and a lot of people do it, and I get it. But people really need to put their money where their mouth is. And to be honest, in the end, though, I think people are going to find that more sustainable solutions that are microgrids and everything else will actually be better for you as a business down the road. It just might be higher cost right now, whether it's a solid oxide fuel cell or a PEM fuel cell or a PV with battery storage or anything like that. In the end, you will have a better business built around that, whether it's operations or kind of what Carsten was talking about is the OpEx versus the CapEx thing.
Alrighty, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I do want to finish off with just getting your final, I suppose, the takeaways you want folks to leave with. And there was a question that came in as well. But I suppose just on that energy question, Tony, you mentioned it there. It's today diesel generators, then lithium ion batteries. Maybe it's a gas turbine. Maybe there's solar or wind, or connected up to the grid. Now we're starting to see a lot more, hydrogen electrolyzers, different types of flow batteries. Hey, in a couple of years' time, we might be using SMRs, small modular reactors, in different places, right?
We can only hope.
It's certainly a what would you say, something for the future. Now, look, the whole net zero in an industrial world, it's a massive topic. We were focused here just purely, let's say, on the trend that everybody is seeing out there, that bringing data closer to the customer. It's all about the, let's say, data center at the edge. You need to think of the whole the scope 1, 2, and 3. Think about it differently. We got through a fraction of the questions. I think there's still about 15 or 16 open, and many of the questions are, but it's hard to get all the data from people. There's no standards. What kind of energy? It's a huge topic. So if I may, Tony, what would be the key takeaway you'd say to people that if they're looking at edge data centers, what do they need to think about differently to start?
I think it's, you need to ask your provider what Carsten had mentioned, which is what are your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions? And I do think a good edge provider should be able to tell you that now, because they're building it. I mean, they could be building a large scale, but the unit is a lot smaller. And so it's easier to kind of get your foot in the door to do those scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions right now. And I think you need to, you need to buy with that kind of sustainability in mind aspect of it, and not just accept, what could be possibly the cheapest version, or you need to kind of, really kind of ask those kind of questions right now and really push the issue and, vote with your money on what you want for your, to build the basis of whatever company you're trying to do. It's kind of a roundabout way of saying it, but it's just, sustainability needs to be 1 or 2, and it needs to be before your bottom line.
Thanks, Tony. And Carsten, for the folks you work with, where do you tell them to start when you look at all this? Oh, sorry, you're on mute, Carson.
Sorry. So I fall in the same trap, right? Muting myself. All right. So to summarize it, I think regardless whether it's data center operations, industrial manufacturing, transportation, whatever it is, I think every organization needs to set their own net zero goal. By when do I want to achieve it, right? And then they can ask themselves, how do I do it? So the first thing in order to do how to do it is, measure your process, get the data so you can identify, so where you can become more sustainable, whether it's in energy consumption, sourcing materials, that are more sustainable, and then you can identify those kind of savings. And then ultimately, ideally you want to electrify your operation and power those processes, with sustainable energy energy that was generated sustainably. And then since we can't do it all alone, we have to partner with companies. So partner with companies, whether it's, Compass or our company like Schneider Electric or others, who are fully committed to sustainability, who are able to Tony's point, to not only give you a good product that performs well, but it's also sustainable. So we see it right now where in the purchasing or acquisition process of acquiring products and services, buyers are no longer exclusively looking at, how much does it cost and when can I get it, because it's a big challenge right now, but also they're evaluating what's my overall greenhouse gas emissions profile. So how sustainable is this? So then make smart choices, smart decisions. And this goes back to one of the things, one of the questions we had, about smart people. So, if we act smart, then we can actually make a contribution. So that's how it goes.
Thanks, Carson, and thanks, Tony. Folks, the clock is against us. The next session will be starting shortly. You'll see a poll pop up there. Please do rate it. I apologize we didn't get to all the questions. I know Carolina and Lucian and the team will be following up with many of you offline on this. This session has been recorded, so obviously folks will be watching this over the next days, weeks, months. But Tony, Carson, thank you so much. It's bright and early where you guys are, so thank you very much for joining. People can find your bios on IIoT World, and I'm sure they can reach out to you on LinkedIn or email or whatever, right?
Definitely. Let's keep the conversation going, because I think we all need to be involved in this, and it needs to be discussion from every single level. So, please reach out, at least, from me, and definitely bomb Carsten with a bunch of emails, but happy to have those discussions, via email, LinkedIn, whatever you want to do. I think it's important. We're talking about it now.
Yeah, it's a very important topic, and so thank you so much for having us here today, and sharing our thoughts and ideas with that.
No, and thanks again, Carson, for Schneider Electric for sponsoring this session. With that, thank you very much, folks. Thanks for everyone who joined from around the world, and I think on to the next sessions. Thank you.